So why don't we begin? Hi everyone, my name's Russ Weninger. I'm an immigration lawyer with the Weninger Jong law firm. And today's webinar is going to be on various work permit options. Before I get into it, I'd like to give a special thanks to the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, CCIS, for promoting the initial webinar that I did a couple of weeks ago as part of this webinar series. And I'd also like to thank my articling student, Sunny Liu, who's been doing an excellent job of helping me produce these webinars. She's been doing a lot of back-end work and helping me organize things, so thanks so much, Sunny. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into it. I'm going to try as much as possible to keep questions towards the end. You can use the chat feature to ask your questions. Sunny will compile them and pass them on to me, and then I'll try to answer as many as possible towards the end of the webinar. There won't be any discussion about my law firm's services or fees during this webinar. I won't be discussing other areas of law, only immigration law. So for example, employment law, things like that, I won't be getting into. Landlord-tenant law, that sort of thing, I won't be discussing. And I should mention that this presentation will end up on YouTube afterwards. So if you have to leave, or if your connection fails for whatever reason, or if my connection fails, don't worry. I'll be recording this and I'll be posting it to YouTube later on. So a little bit about me. I'm one of the co-founders of the Weninger Jong law firm. I practice primarily in the areas of immigration law, Canadian immigration law, I should say, and wills and estates. I really enjoy playing the piano in my spare time, and as I've mentioned on previous webinars, I'm trying in vain to learn Japanese. It's definitely a work in progress. So this week, my focus is going to be on a few different things. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about the various work permit options. Before we get into that, though, I'm going to be giving a few updates since last week. So I'm going to be talking about working without a work permit, what legal and illegal options there are in that regard, closed work permit options, open work permit options. I'm going to mention a few resources that people might want to check out, and then at the end I'm going to get to questions. So I should mention a few updates since last week. So last week, or since last week, some people have sent in some questions to me. And by the way, I encourage that. So if you have any questions over the next week, feel free to reach out to me, send me an email, or leave a comment somewhere sensible on my YouTube channel so that I'll see it, or on the Weninger Jong YouTube channel so that I'll see it. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer as many of those questions, or prepare answers for as many of those questions as possible. But anyways, one of the viewers sent in a question about biometrics, and they were asking, so what happens if you can't get your biometrics done because the offices are closed? And that's a very good question. So right now, for the most part, it's very difficult for people to actually get their biometrics done. In fact, I think it's virtually impossible for people to get their biometrics done at the moment. In Canada, offices for biometrics are closed most overseas offices doing biometrics, I think, are probably closed at the moment. So it's very difficult to get that done, and that's a requirement in most cases for work permits. So IRCC, they've issued an automatic 90-day period for getting biometrics done. In the past, it's been 30 days that they've given people to get biometrics, so now it's 90 days. And if you can't get it done, you can submit a web form explanation and explain the circumstances. So that's what it says on this link that I provided on this slide. That if you can't get your biometrics done for any reason, just send in a web form explanation. In all likelihood, if biometric offices remain closed past 90 days, then CIC will give a further extension, and they've indicated on the website that they're aware of the closures and they're not going to be rejecting people's applications because they can't do the impossible. In other words, they can't get their biometrics done. So if that's the case with you, don't worry about it. You'll eventually get your work permit processed. And you'll eventually be able to get your biometrics done, but it might take longer than 90 days potentially. It's really hard to say. I had a lot of questions from people as well about things like, working hours for students and those sorts of things. By the way, I should give a shout out to Bow Valley College as well. I know that Bow Valley has been referring a lot of students to my channel and to these webinars, and I very much appreciate that. So thanks, Bow Valley College. Anyways, a lot of students are concerned about the 20 hour per week limit on work while they're studying. Now, the good news is if you're in a semester break, that doesn't really apply to you. So if you're not taking regular semester courses, but you're on a break, a summer break, for example, then you're not limited to the 20 hours a week. You can work full-time. You can even work longer than full-time. You can have 2 full-time jobs if you want. I know that's unlikely under these economic circumstances, but it's theoretically possible. Also, the government put on their website that they're lifting the 20-hour per week limit on work while students are studying if they're in essential services, so certain healthcare type jobs, frontline service type jobs maybe as well, agricultural jobs, possibly grocery retail, those sorts of things. So if that applies to you, if you're working in an essential occupation, you may be able to benefit from that increase to the or that lifting of the limit, I should say, from 20 hours a week. So I'd recommend checking out that link if you think that 20-hour per week limit applies to you, because going forward, or at least for the next little while, it might not apply to you. So that's some good news. I wanted to issue a clarification as well about the difference between things like temporary resident permits, temporary resident visas, and visitor records, because I think there's some confusion about that. I've been talking a lot about temporary resident permits in my last couple of webinars, and I know this is a confusing distinction because a lot of, oftentimes in my office, I'll have interns and articling students and people like that. And invariably, when I'm trying to teach someone the difference between a temporary resident permit and a temporary resident visa or a visitor record, or if I'm discussing that with a client, oftentimes these concepts or these ideas, they all kind of mesh together, and people sometimes use these terms interchangeably, even though they have very technical meanings. So a temporary resident visa, a TRV, is something that a person uses to come to Canada. So it's a travel document, essentially. So it is something that is put in your passport, and then when you come to Canada and enter Canada, that thing has served its purpose. So it's really only for traveling to Canada that you need a visa. At least that's the way Canadian immigration law defines a visa. So that's what a temporary resident visa is, a TRV. A visitor record is a document that says that you can stay in Canada for a certain period of time as a visitor. Now, you'll note that temporary resident visas and visitor records, they both have expiry dates on them, but those expiry dates mean different things. So a temporary resident visa may have an expiry date on it, and a person might already be in Canada, and they're worried about, well, can I stay in Canada because my visitor visa is about to expire? Well, you're already here in Canada, so the visitor visa has served its purpose. So the expiration date on the visa, it doesn't necessarily affect you if you're already in Canada. It will affect you if you're leaving Canada and want to come back. But if you're already in Canada, the expiration of a temporary resident visa doesn't really matter. The expiration of a visitor record, though, does matter. It means that your status your lawful status as a visitor in Canada has expired if that expiration date has been reached. In some cases, people can apply to extend, and they might be on implied status, for example, while they're waiting for their application to be approved, but the expiry date on the visitor record tends to indicate, or does indicate, I should say, when your lawful status in Canada expires. Now, a temporary resident permit is different from a temporary resident visa, and it's different from a visitor record. A temporary resident permit is a permit that allows you to stay in Canada, even though ordinarily you wouldn't be allowed to stay in Canada. So ordinarily you wouldn't have lawful, you wouldn't be able to qualify for lawful temporary residence here. It might be due to, inadmissibility due to health. It might be due to the fact that you otherwise aren't a good candidate for temporary residence. It might be due to a criminal inadmissibility problem. There are all sorts of reasons why a person might be inadmissible to Canada or might not qualify for lawful temporary status in Canada, but a temporary resident permit can be a way around that. So if you are given a temporary resident permit, that means that you can stay in Canada, notwithstanding the fact that, otherwise there might be some impediments to you staying here, if that makes sense. Now, a temporary resident permit can also, in some cases, be paired with a work permit or a study permit. So sometimes a person can become a worker or can become a student because of the fact that they've qualified for a temporary resident permit. So a temporary resident permit is potentially a very useful tool for someone who has some compelling reason to stay in Canada, but otherwise doesn't qualify to remain in Canada. So temporary resident permits, they're very distinct from visitor records, and they're very distinct from temporary resident visas. Hopefully that makes sense. If you still have any questions about that, feel free to enter those questions into the chat box, or you may possibly send me an email afterwards. And if there is still confusion, I'll maybe talk about that in next week's webinar as well. By the way, I should mention I'm planning on making this a weekly event, so if you have nothing better to do next Wednesday at 10, feel free to join me at that time for next week's webinar. I haven't decided what the topic will be, but I'm going to make these things a weekly event. Now. Someone else reached out to me, and they indicated to me a possible problem with the CERB, the Canada's Emergency Relief Benefit, I believe is the full version of the acronym. And this problem with the CRB is that, so what happens if your work permit is about to expire and you submit an application for a new work permit? So you have implied status, or at least you think you have implied status, but then your work permit application gets rejected. What will happen if during that period of time of implied status, or what you thought was implied status, you applied for and received the CERB? Will the government consider that to be fraud? Will Canada Revenue Agency require their money back? So what's going to happen there? So my suspicion is that if you have lawful implied status, that you won't have a problem, even if your application is later rejected, as long as during that period of time you had valid implied status. Now, where it gets a little dicey is if you submit woefully inadequate applications. So you send a work permit application in without the right fees, for example, or it's just entirely incomplete for some reason, and it gets bounced back to you, and the government says, we can't process this because you didn't pay the right fees, or you didn't submit half the documents, or something like that. So in those sorts of cases, if you haven't submitted a complete application, it might be the case that the government will take the position that you didn't, in fact, have implied status. So that's a possible concern with the CERB. If IRCC is taking the position that you didn't really submit an application at all, it wasn't just a rejected application, it was a non-application to begin with. Who knows? Maybe the government may require you to pay back the CERB if you've been receiving it during what you thought was the period of implied status. So for that reason, I'd strongly recommend to anyone who's going to be going on implied status and might be applying for CERB to make absolutely certain that they've paid the right fees, that they've submitted a complete work permit application. You want to be dotting your I's and crossing your T's. So that leads to the next slide, which is covering some general strategies that I think apply to basically everyone who might be watching this webinar. So if you don't remember anything else, remember this. In any application you're submitting, you should be noting the special humanitarian circumstances that you are facing and that all of society is facing at the moment as well. So you should be highlighting your particular circumstances, the hardships you're facing, maybe you can't even travel to your home country at the moment. You should be noting that, and you should be noting the severity of the COVID-19 situation as well. I think that's very important to highlight in any application that's currently being submitted. You also want to try as much as possible to sell yourself as being a good, smart, hardworking person who will make some sort of substantial contribution to Canadian society, and that contribution might be as simple as for example, working in an essential service or contributing in some way to the Canadian economy through the payment of taxes and that sort of thing. So you want to highlight humanitarian circumstances. You want to try as much as possible to demonstrate that you would make a good contribution to Canadian society. You also want to dot your I's and cross your T's on any immigration application or any application for temporary residence, whether it be a work permit application, study permit application, anything at all. You want to be making sure that you're submitting the best possible application you can be submitting, because the stakes are high. Okay, so we've dealt with a lot of the preliminary stuff. Now let's get into the meat of the webinar. So we're going to be talking about working options. So possible work permit options, possible options that don't require a work permit. Let's first of all start there. Options that don't require a work permit. Now, it should be noted that some of those options are legal and some of them are illegal. So technically a person could work without a work permit if they're being paid under the table and they didn't care about being caught. I don't necessarily recommend that, and in fact, in most cases, I would strongly recommend against doing that. I think the only time where something like that might be justified is if you're in very dire financial straits and you're worried about not being able to feed yourself, for example, or you're worried about being evicted because you can't pay rent. But even then, it's technically illegal. So if you have savings, if you have enough to survive, to pay your rent, to pay food, that sort of thing, I would strongly discourage illegal work. But if a person's life is in jeopardy, if they're faced with the prospect of living on the street or not being able to put food on the table, sometimes they do desperate things, and I'll leave it at that. You know what I'm saying. Under Canadian law, a person can also work without a work permit if they're not entering into the labor market in Canada. So, for example, let's say you're working as a computer programmer for an overseas company. You're either doing salary work or you're doing contract work, but this work doesn't require you to be in Canada. You could be doing this work from anywhere in the world potentially, and maybe in fact you did this work from your home country, and now you're just working remotely from your laptop in Canada, but your company's office, let's say, or the employer is situated overseas. So if you're doing something like that, for example, you're not really entering the Canadian labor market, and you can potentially do something like that without getting a work permit. So that's something to keep in mind. A lot of freelance work, a lot of contract work, a lot of remote work. If the employer is based overseas, and if there's no real geographical tie to the work that you're doing, it doesn't require you to be physically in Canada, then, and you're not dealing, let's say, directly with Canadian clients or customers, or so it isn't that sort of a thing where, for example, you're doing sales here, or you're servicing Canadian clients or something like that. So it's purely remote work, and there's no geographical tie to it. Then you probably don't need a work permit for that. In many cases, religious workers don't need work permits. So those are people who come to work in various capacities for a religious organization. The classic example is, something like a pastor, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the pastor. It could be some lay religious worker. But religious workers oftentimes can work in Canada just on a visitor record, so they don't even necessarily need a work permit for that. International students. So we've already discussed this a little bit, but international students are allowed to work on campus, and they're also allowed to work for up to 20 hours a week off campus during regular periods of study, and they're allowed to work as much as they want during things like semester breaks or after they've graduated and while they're waiting for their postgraduate work permit to come in, for example. So international students in most cases can work without a work permit. Now, there are some exceptions to that. So if you're an international student, but you're not doing a degree or diploma or certificate program, you're for example, just doing ESL or something like that, then you're probably not eligible for or to work without a work permit. But if you're doing something like a degree program or a diploma program and it's through a designated learning institution, it's not something like a career college. You're not taking a security guard program or something like that. You're taking a program in nursing or a program in computer science or programs, something like that's an actual degree program or that is not done through a career college. That sort of program will typically qualify a student to work without a work permit, as long as they have a valid study permit. And business visitors, so people who are coming here sometimes to do sales, sometimes to meet with suppliers, those sorts of people, maybe to do an exploratory visit for the purpose of setting up a branch office in Canada. Those sorts of people, technically they're doing their job, they're doing some work, but that's not considered entering the Canadian labor market. So those sorts of people, and usually that's for a very short duration, but those sorts of people can typically come to Canada and do their work, but without getting a work permit. Now, in general, when a person is applying for a work permit, there are two different general categories of work permit that a person can apply for. So there are closed work permits, which have restrictions on the type of work you can do. Usually the restrictions are based on the employer, but they can also be based on the location of the work, the type of work as well. So those things are closed work permits. They have some sort of restriction on the type of work you can do. Then there are open work permits, which don't have any restrictions on them. They'll have an expiration date, for example, but and they may say that you can't work in certain occupations unless you get a medical or something like that. But or that you can't work in, even with open work permits, you're not allowed to work in the sex trade or in strip clubs or certain things like that. But for the most part, with an open work permit, you can work in any occupation for any employer, and with a closed work permit, there are significant limitations on what work you can do. Now, the most classic example of a closed work permit is an LMIA-based work permit. So that's a type of work permit where the employer has applied for permission to hire a foreign worker. And currently that's probably not an easy application for an employer to make. So with an LMIA, you have to advertise a position for several weeks in most cases, and then you have to apply to the government and indicate that you haven't been able to find qualified Canadians or permanent residents who are willing and able to do that work. In the past, sometimes employers were able to qualify for LMIAs, especially in certain types of industries and in certain geographical regions in Canada. Now I suspect it's going to be very difficult for people for employers to qualify for LMIAs. In the media, they've been talking about the Temporary Foreign Worker Program and about how it's still going ahead, and how they've even implied that it might be easier for employers to hire people under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. What they're talking about in those media reports is the seasonal agricultural worker program. So oftentimes farms in different regions in Canada will bring foreign workers during the summer months to work in their farms or to do certain agricultural labor tasks. Now, the government has, in some respects, made it easier for those employers to hire those types of temporary foreign workers. But in general, the temporary foreign worker program is, my strong suspicion is that it's going to be grinding to a halt for other types of occupations. So for service industry type occupations, for example, hospitality type occupations, I suspect the temporary foreign worker program is going to be dead for the next several months. So I strongly suspect employers are going to have great difficulty qualifying for LMIAs. A typical requirement in an LMIA is that you can't have been laying people off recently. And in service industry jobs, a lot of people have been laid off in the last little while. So the point I'm trying to make is, don't hold your breath when it comes to LMIA applications. You might be lucky. You might have an employer who already has an LMIA that they haven't used, for example. There might be some special circumstances where employers might still qualify for LMIAs going forward, but in most cases, I think LMIAs are going to be tough sells. There are also another common type of closed work permit is a work permit that's based on an international free trade agreement. So, for example, engineers under NAFTA. If you're an American citizen or a Mexican citizen, and you're an engineer and you get offered a job in Canada, you can typically qualify for a NAFTA work permit. So there are all sorts of work permit options available for people under NAFTA, and each free trade agreement is a little bit different. So Canada has agreements with the US and Mexico, but they also have agreements with Chile and Korea and Japan and all sorts of European countries. And each of those free trade agreements is a little bit different. So if you think you might qualify under a free trade agreement, it's worth looking into. But for the most part, the countries that Canada has free trade agreements with they're kind of affluent first world countries. Let me put it that way. So there are not a lot of third world countries, for example, that have those types of free trade agreements with Canada where there are labor mobility provisions, for example. Another type of closed work permit is an intercompany transfer work permit. What that permits is, in some cases, someone who has worked in an important position for a company overseas, if that company has a branch office in Canada or some type of affiliated office in Canada, the person can potentially transfer to the Canadian office, provided that they're going to be doing similar high-level work in the Canadian office. So for example, someone who's a business executive for IBM in India, they might be transferred to the Canadian office of IBM to work as a business executive here. Now with intercompany transfers, typically you need either some high-level managerial type work experience, or you have to have some specialized proprietary or technical knowledge or something like that. So it's not meant for general laborers. It's not meant for entry level type people in a company. It's meant for senior people in a company. Senior people with some sort of specialized knowledge or who are in important managerial or executive positions. There's also an excellent program for people who are French speaking and they intend to work outside of Quebec. For those sorts of people, if they're going to be working in a skilled occupation, they can typically qualify for what's called a mobilité francophone work permit, and that enables people who are fluent in French to work in skilled occupations outside of the province of Quebec. That's a very good option for anyone who has that type of skilled work experience and they're fluent in French and they're willing to work outside of Quebec. There are also charitable or religious work permits. Earlier I was talking about how religious workers can sometimes work without a work permit, but they can also apply for a work permit, and there are advantages to doing that. So if you want to apply for permanent residence later on, it's probably better to be doing your religious work with a work permit rather than without. Also, charitable workers in many cases can qualify for work permits. Caregivers in many cases could qualify for work permits as well. So for example, let's say there's a Canadian couple, the husband is maybe I'll use the example of my sister and brother-in-law. So my sister is a nurse at one of the hospitals in Calgary, and my brother-in-law is one of the managers in a grocery store in Calgary. And so they're both working in essential services, and they've got some young kids. And so if someone like them, for example, they wanted to apply to get they wanted to hire a foreign nanny to help look after their kids while they're both working in these essential jobs. A person could, someone like them could apply potentially to get a caregiver, and the person they were interested in hiring could apply for a caregiver work permit. There are some restrictions on that program. There are certain special requirements to qualifying for a work permit on that program. It's not necessarily as easy as it used to be. There are basic educational requirements, language requirements, things like that for qualifying for a caregiver work permit. But it is theoretically possible to qualify for a caregiver work permit even at this time. There are also work permits related to International Experience Canada. So some people have come over on working holiday work permits. Those are open work permits, but there are also closed work permits that require job offers under International Experience Canada. So in one case, there's the Young Professional program, which is for people of a certain age, typically under the age of 30 or 35, I think, in some cases, who maybe they just finished a university degree or something like that, and then they got they've received a job offer to work in a related occupation in Canada, and similar to that is the International Co-op program. Now, those programs require people to have arranged employment with particular employers, and people have to apply through that program. So not every country has that type of arrangement with Canada where their citizens can come through International Experience Canada to work. But if your country does have that sort of arrangement with Canada, you might be able to benefit from one of those work permits. I talked about this a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but there are also significant benefit work permits that may apply to some people. The classic example is a business owner. So someone's going to come, they're going to purchase a business or set up a business, either lease or purchase commercial real estate in Canada. They're going to be hiring some Canadian citizens or permanent residents to work in the business. So those sorts of people who are doing something to stimulate the Canadian economy, business owners, those sorts of people, they can in some cases qualify for a significant benefit work permit. That can also in some cases apply to people like academics or researchers, or people who have some special cultural contribution to make to Canadian society, for example. Now, it's also possible for someone who's going to set up a business in Canada, in some cases, to qualify for what's called an owner-operator LMIA-based work permit. So they're actually applying for an LMIA so that they can get a work permit, but in this case, the LMIA isn't based on showing that there aren't Canadians or permanent residents who are available to do the work. The LMIA is instead based on the fact that the person is going to be coming to Canada and setting up a business in Canada and then employing Canadians and doing things like that. So for some people, an owner-operator LMIA based work permit might be an option if they've got a lot of money and they're looking at setting up a business in Canada. Some bridging work permits are also closed work permits. So, for example, if a person applies under, let's say, a provincial nominee program, and that provincial nominee program requires a person to maintain their employment with a particular employer while they are applying for permanent residence, then they might be able to qualify during the permanent residence application stage. They might be able to qualify for a bridging work permit, but in many cases, the bridging work permit will have employment restrictions on it. So some of those bridging work permits are actually closed work permits. Now let's go to open work permits. So a classic example of an open work permit is a spousal open work permit, where a spouse of a skilled worker can qualify for a work permit. So if the spouse is a skilled worker and they're here as a temporary worker, so they've got a work permit to work in Canada, and they're working in a skilled occupation, then potentially their spouse or common law partner can qualify for an open work permit. Now one common problem with those types of applications is, for example, the spouse might in fact be working in a skilled occupation, but they don't provide proof of that when the spouse who's applying for an open work permit applies for their open work permit, and so if that happens, then the application is rejected. So if you're applying for a spousal open work permit, you want to make absolute certain that you provide concrete proof that your spouse who's working in a skilled occupation, that they're working in Canada under a valid work permit and that they're in fact currently employed. So it's not just enough to prove that they've got a work permit and that they've got a work permit that permits them to work in a skilled occupation. What you have to show is that they're actually working in that occupation. Get a letter from the employer to say that, for example. You use tax records, T4s and things like that, pay stubs, things like that, to show that the spouse is in fact currently working in a skilled occupation. A sponsored spouse, so someone who is being sponsored for permanent residence due to the fact that they have a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident spouse or common law partner who's sponsoring them. That sort of person, once the application has been submitted, they can typically apply for an open work permit as well. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of bridging work permits are in fact open work permits. So if you apply under most express entry streams and many provincial nominee streams, you can, once you've submitted your permanent residence application, as long as you're within I think it's 90 days or 3 months from your work permit expiring, and your work permit hasn't already expired, you can qualify for that bridging work permit, and in many cases it will be an open work permit. I was talking about this a little bit earlier, but some countries have agreements with Canada that allows their young people, so people under the age of 30 or under the age of 35, to come to Canada on working holiday work permits, and those work permits are open work permits. One of the most common open work permits out there is the postgraduate work permit. So that's a work permit that's available to international students, people who have completed a degree program or a certificate or diploma program, and they haven't applied for a postgraduate work permit previously. So it's a once in a lifetime thing, and typically if the person has completed a program that's at least 2 years in length, they can qualify for a 3-year postgraduate work permit. So that's quite significant. It allows a person to work in any occupation that they're hired for, for up to 3 years. And then there are TRP-based work permits. So I was talking about that earlier. If a person qualifies for a TRP, and that TRP is for at least 6 months in duration, they can oftentimes qualify for a work permit during that period of time. So I've got this with a question mark: significant benefit work permit. If you're currently in Canada, maybe currently working, and you think that you can make the case that your ability to continue to legally work in Canada would be helpful to the Canadian economy because, let's say, you're working in an essential service, it might be worth trying to apply for a significant benefit work permit, even if you don't qualify for any other type of work permit. I'm not really sure how immigration officers are going to treat those types of applications, but it might be worth attempting, and maybe you pair that with a temporary resident permit application, for example. There are also work permits that are available for vulnerable or exploited workers. So people who, sometimes workers come to Canada and their employers don't pay them properly, or they abuse them in some way, or they change their work conditions in some some unfavorable way. In some cases, those types of workers can qualify for an open work permit. And then the question is, well, could that apply, for example, to people who, let's say, they're working in an unsafe condition in, a meat processing plant, for example. I'm not saying that this applies to Cargill, but recently the Cargill meat processing plant was in the news because a lot of the workers there contracted COVID-19, and a lot of the workers are temporary foreign workers, so they're LMIA-based work permit holders. And there have been some complaints, and I'm not saying this is substantiated or well-founded or whatever, but there have been complaints raised by some workers that, at the plant, the conditions weren't ideal. The social distancing wasn't possible. Maybe worker safety wasn't placed as the highest priority. Would those sorts of workers qualify for a vulnerable worker work permit? Maybe. So if the conditions are dangerous enough in employment, and the worker feels like they can't continue to work there, maybe they should look into something like the vulnerable worker work permit. If in some cases, if someone is here on a study permit, but they're becoming financially destitute and they can't pay their bills, and maybe their funding from overseas has been cut off for whatever reason, and they need to work to survive, sometimes they can qualify for a work permit. And under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulation, under Section 208, that allows for that type of work permit. Also, refugee claimants or people who are facing an unenforceable removal order can qualify for an open work permit too. Now I want to leave you with some general suggestions about work permits or applications for work permits. One thing I'd strongly recommend to people is that they not flagpole. Canada Border Services, for those who don't know what flagpoling means, flagpoling is when you drive to the border and just cross the border just for the purpose of applying for a work permit or extending your status in Canada, or in some cases even people will flagpole to finish a permanent residence application to get their permanent residence. Now, Canada Border Services has basically shut down flagpoling. So if you drive down to the border just for the purpose of flagpoling, you're probably not going to get what you want. So Canada Border Services, they won't issue you a work permit, and in fact they might do other things that go contrary to your interests. So they might search your phone and search what you've got in your car, and they might discover that you've been doing a part-time job for cash that you shouldn't have been doing, or they might look through your checking account by getting access to your banking information from you, and they'll discover that you were receiving money maybe that you shouldn't have been receiving through unauthorized work or something like that. Those are the potential drawbacks to flagpoling in the best of times. But now, not only are you opening up yourself to that type of investigation from Canada Border Services, but you're not even getting the benefit of possibly getting a work permit. So just don't flagpole. Don't drive down to the border. It's not going to do you any good. So try to avoid the border in general, but especially now if you're looking at flagpoling, just don't do it. I'd strongly recommend anyone applying for a work permit to apply as soon as reasonably possible. Avoid shady arrangements. So don't apply, if someone says, give me $50,000 and I'll quote unquote hire you, and I'll say you were working for me doing this managerial type job or something like that, and you don't even have to show up to work, and you don't even have to have any special qualifications. And it's surprising how often I hear of people who have fallen for that sort of scam. And it's very shady, and it's certainly not legitimate, and it will only lead to problems for you down the road. So don't do anything like that. If you're offered a job, make sure it's a legitimate job. Make sure you're not paying for that job. If you're paying for that job, it's not a real job. Okay? So avoid those sorts of arrangements. Make sure in any type of application you're submitting, you're following the government's instructions to the T. So that's important at any time, but it's especially important now. And I always encourage people to get professional help when they're doing these types of applications, and I'd strongly recommend that people go with lawyers, in most cases, rather than immigration consultants. Here are a couple of tools that people might find useful. One is an IRCC tool, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada tool, that allows you to determine your work permit eligibility. So you basically fill out a questionnaire online, and then IRCC will tell you if you might possibly qualify for a certain type of work permit. The other resource I linked to here is a guide for doing temporary resident permit applications. Now I'll handle a few different questions. One question I received was, how will my eligibility for a postgraduate work permit be affected if I pursue studies overseas? And that's a very good question. So the postgraduate work permit typically has to be applied for within 6 months of 180 days or something like that, within completing your studies in Canada. So if you just take off, go back to your home country, for example, and pursue studies there, you might miss that window of opportunity to apply for a postgraduate work permit. What you could potentially do is apply for a postgraduate work permit before you leave, and then go and do your studies, and maybe by the time you get your postgraduate work permit, you've completed a semester overseas or something like that. If your postgraduate work permit is good for 3 years, you might be able to come back after you've done your semester abroad and start working. But you do have to apply for that postgraduate work permit within, I'm going to say, approximately 6 months of completing your studies in Canada. Another question is, how will eligibility for the postgraduate work permit be affected if studies are completed remotely in the student's home country due to the border closure? That's an excellent question. Now, I was looking at some information about a federal court case, I believe it was, that considered a similar issue. In that case, the student was doing correspondence courses or remote study courses that were done through the school they were actually enrolled in, and for most semesters they were doing live full-time courses at that institution. But for the last semester before they graduated, they did a lot of remote study courses through the institution that were recommended by their instructors at the institution. I think in that case the court felt that was fine, that it was overall part of their program of study in Canada. Now, let's say though that you go back home and you spend the next year or two doing courses through U of C or Bow Valley College or something like that, but all your courses are done remotely and you're not actually living in Canada. I think that's going to affect postgraduate work permit eligibility. Who knows? The government may actually come out with a policy on that, but for the time being, I think you have to assume that if you're doing too many of your courses remotely, and especially if you're leaving Canada and going back home, eligibility for that postgraduate work permit may not be there at the end of the day. So that's something to keep in mind. It might be better or safer, even if you're doing remote study courses, to be doing them within Canada, if you want to maintain the possibility of getting that postgraduate work permit. Another question I received was, if students are graduating and want to return home, how will that affect eligibility for a postgraduate work permit? Again, they might be able to do that, but they have that approximately 6-month window after graduating to apply for the postgraduate work permit. And if they don't apply within that period of time, they might miss their chance. Another question is, can out-of-status students take online classes? If they're purely online, then yeah, potentially they can. But if there's an in-Canada component to the course, if they're out of status, and in fact if they don't have valid student status, they probably shouldn't be taking the course. Now, in some cases, certain courses are not considered, courses that require a study permit. So if you're taking a course that's purely personal interest, maybe you're I don't know, taking, a karate class or a class on, tea appreciation or something like that, and it's not through a certificate program at a university or college. It's just more a personal interest type course. Well, in that sort of case, it wouldn't be online anyways, but yeah. So if it's an online course or if it's a personal interest course, potentially you can do that without having a study permit. Just going to check the stream to see if there are any questions. Andrea asks, I have a working holiday visa that will expire in June, and my employer offered me an LMIA, but I don't know if it could be really be possible to achieve at this moment. What do you recommend? You're absolutely right, Andrea. Your employer might not qualify for the LMIA. They might have the intention of applying, but they might not qualify. So, by all means, if your employer is willing to apply, they could apply, and that could be an option for you if they get the work permit. But don't put all your eggs in one basket. So, maybe look at some of the other options that I discussed in this presentation. By the way, I'll be putting this online afterwards, so if you want to review what we've talked about, you can check it online afterwards. Maybe something like a temporary resident permit application might be a possibility. Colleen asks, students who have applied for a new co-op work permit together and got biometrics request, if they send a web form before 90 days, any chances it will be processed without biometrics? That's a good question. IRCC might be able to, or might be willing, depending on how long this pandemic lasts. Who knows? Maybe they'll process applications without biometrics. Maybe they'll dispense with the requirement. It's too early to say at this point. At this point, I would assume that most applications or all applications are going to require biometrics at some point. But that may not be the case. The government may change the policy on that. Hal asks, are closed work permits suspended due to COVID-19? No, not necessarily. If you have valid status as a worker, that status remains with you despite COVID-19. So you're allowed to lawfully remain in Canada if you've got a closed work permit, as long as the work permit hasn't expired already. And in some cases, the government's going to be needing foreign workers, for example, in the agricultural program. So, not all closed work permits are it's certainly not the case that closed work permits are being suspended due to COVID-19, and it's also not necessarily the case that that closed work permits won't be options going forward. In many cases, I think people will be able to still qualify for closed work permits. Christina asks, I'm in Canada on my working holiday visa, IEC, expiring June 18th. In January, I applied for a young professional permit, was approved, so I received my letter. How can I get a work permit? That's a very good question, Christina. So in most cases, people on those working holiday, or I shouldn't say working holiday, International Experience Canada work permits, or if they've been approved for one of those work permits but don't yet have the work permit, usually what they have to do is leave Canada and come back in. Now I already mentioned that flag polling isn't an option. What you might have to do is actually fly out of Canada and fly back in. Will the Canadian government process some of those applications internally? Maybe. I'm not sure about that, but I know at this point in time, people who are doing those IEC work permit applications, or at least historically, people have done IEC work permit applications. They've had to get the work permit upon entry into Canada. So I hope that answers your question. I think that might be it for questions. Once again, I'd like to thank the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, CCIS, for helping to promote this webinar. I'd like to thank my articling student, Sunny Lou JD, who is going to be a full-fledged lawyer probably in about 6 months' time, a little more than 6 months. Sunny's doing a bang-up job and is really helping me out, and I'm sure she'll be an excellent immigration lawyer in her career, her post-articling student career. And thank you for watching. I very much appreciate the fact that people are taking advantage of these webinars, watching these webinars, and I'm always open for content. So if you have any content suggestions, please reach out to me. Let me know what you'd like to discuss in the webinars. Let me know if you have any questions. I'd be happy to include those in upcoming webinars. And another thing I'm thinking about doing is putting free courses on the YouTube channel on different applications that might be of benefit to people. So for example, I was thinking of doing a free course on humanitarian applications or on temporary resident permit applications, or maybe on certain type of worker applications. So if you want to send me some feedback, either by commenting in the webinar, through YouTube on what you'd like to see in upcoming webinars, or what kind of thing you'd like to see discussed in a free online course, reach out to me, let me know. Comment in this video that's posted online about what you might want to see in a free course, and I'm happy to entertain suggestions on course topics. And if you want to reach me, you can find me at weningerjong.com. You can also check out the Weninger Jong YouTube channel that you're currently streaming from, and you can send me an email at info@weningerjong.com. Well, thank you for watching, and maybe I'll again have a chance to spend some time with you next week. Bye for now.